But I want to say a few words about how we get there, how we get to this problem historically, because it's something that does come out of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. The person we're reading for today is David Hume, who is famous for introducing the gap between is and ought. And that's precisely the gap that we're going to be focusing on throughout this course. In a world described by science, and purely described in terms of is, how do we actually introduce any concept of value? What's the place for an ought or an ought not? For anything being called good or bad, just or unjust, and so on. But how does that become an intellectual crisis by the beginning of the 20th century? We have to go back a bit to the agricultural and industrial revolutions, and indeed to the scientific revolution that made those possible. Something dramatic happened around 1750 in Western Europe, that really, and then somewhat later in other parts of the world, that has transformed the way people live. If around 1750 you examined how the average person lived, the answer would be basically how average people have lived all the way throughout history. For thousands of years, the answer would have been more or less the same. But starting in 1750, things changed dramatically. And they changed partly because of an intellectual revolution that occurred about 100 years before. So there was an increase in our understanding of nature, in especially the 17th century. That led to the invention of technology, and that technology transformed human relationships. First by transforming agriculture, making it possible to grow much more food with much less labor than had been possible before. And then in the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution, making it possible to produce products on a large scale in a way that had never been possible before. So, let's talk about really three revolutions that issued from the scientific revolution. First, that agricultural revolution, which did make it possible to grow much more food. Before 1750, everybody, except a few in the upper classes in a given society, were concerned primarily with getting enough food to eat. 80% of the population consisted of farmers. That changed dramatically starting around 1750. So, let's take a look at that first of all. What happened? People learned how to grow food much more effectively. And that meant there was more food. It meant the price of food dropped dramatically. People had to devote much less of their income to actually just getting enough, and much less of their time. It required less labor to produce food than it had before. That left people more money for other things. And it also produced a condition of surplus labor. There were people who were no longer needed on the farms and were able to do other things with their time and their lives. It also produced a certain amount of capital for investment. How? Well, because people were able to grow food much more efficiently, they were able to accumulate more than they could use. They were no longer, in other words, subsistence farmers, but farmers could have enough for their own use and to sell in the marketplace. It led to larger farms. It led to a kind of surplus of income that pooled together enabled people to do things like build factories. So it became possible for people to understand how to use pesticides, for example, how to use fertilizers, how to plant crops in rotation so that fields became much more productive, how to guard against diseases of plants, against insects. And all of that led to a bounty that had been unknown in previous periods of human history. We go into a vegetable market today, we see arrays like this. Before 1750, it would have been an extraordinary thing to see that kind of bounty anywhere, except maybe right at harvest time. So what enabled farms to become that much more productive? Part of it was technology. Part of it was an understanding of how to grow things more effectively. But partly it was also a political revolution. It was a concept of individual property, of individual rights, formulated initially by John Locke, and then implemented in England and other countries that gave people rights to land. Now, why was that so crucial? Well, suppose you are a feudal lord who is subject to the whims of some feudal superior. Okay, perhaps you are in control of this bit of property. I mean, maybe you're down at the bottom and you have no control at all, but even here, you are subject to the person you serve, who is subject to someone else who is subject to the king. You don't really have any title except what is given to you by the person above you in the hierarchy. And they can take it away at any time. Is it worthwhile for you to invest a lot in equipment, for you to invest a lot in land, for you to invest a lot in making your land more productive? Answer is no, because if it gets too productive, it will be taken away. Now, the closest thing we have to that kind of feudal hierarchy might be a university. And indeed, there is that problem here. Suppose you start some research institute or some other program, and you start fundraising for it, and at first, you know, you have a hard time, there's not much money, but you get good at it, and you start raising money, and all of a sudden you've got $1 million sitting in the account. You become a ripe takeover target, right? Somebody looks at that and says, wow, they've raised $1 million. You know, why should we be spending it on their crazy research ideas? Why shouldn't we use it for this? And so it's very easy to have those things simply taken over. Now, some people indeed do manage to create such institutes within universities, but there's always this danger that someone, if it gets too juicy, will decide to take it over for themselves, because you're subject, you know, you might be the department chair, but you're subject to the whims of the dean. The dean is subject to the whims of the provost, and so on. And it's a very feudal system. Well, in any kind of feudal system like that, you're vulnerable. However, if you have rights under the law, it becomes a different thing. Then it's your property, and people can't just take it away from you. And all of a sudden, at that point, you've got an incentive to invest to make this more productive. So it's really Locke's ideas about human rights, about individual rights, about property, and then the actual implementation of that in England, and then following that in other countries, that made it possible and worthwhile for people to invest in these improvements in agriculture. So in 1800, 4/5 of the population was dedicated to growing food. 4 out of 5 people were involved in farming in some way. By 1900, only 1 person in 5 was actually involved in farming. That means that 60% of the population who had been working on farms at the beginning of the 19th century were no longer needed on the farms by the end of the 19th century. And that is a huge transformation in how people were spending their time. Today, what percentage of the United States population consists of farmers?
0.8.
0.8. Someone, do you know, or are you guessing? Yeah, okay, that's actually a pretty good guess. It's a little under 2%. Okay, so 1 person in 50 now actually is involved in agriculture. But at the beginning of the 20th century, it was 20%, at the 10 times as many, and at the beginning of the 19th century, it was 80% of the population. That is a huge change in what we do. One of the things that it made possible was the Industrial Revolution. It actually occurred in 2 stages. In the first half of the 19th century, we had what is sometimes called the First Industrial Revolution. It was the early stages of people beginning to build factories, people flocking to the cities for jobs in the factories. They were no longer needed on the farms in the countryside. So bad news is, gosh, lots of unemployment out in the countryside. The good news is, those people were a labor force that could then work in the factories and begin this process of mass producing goods. Well, when 60% of the population moves from the countryside to cities and towns, you can imagine that produces all sorts of problems. What are some problems you might anticipate? Imagine that 60% of the population suddenly moves from one place to another.
There's not a sanitary problem.
Okay, a massive sanitary problem, right? Gosh. I came to Austin in 1980. There's been a huge influx of Austin's population. It's about 3 times the size it was in 1980. But we're not talking, luckily, about 60% of the population moving to Austin. That would be something that we couldn't keep up with, right? We couldn't build enough infrastructure. Actually, we haven't in Austin. The traffic problems become a nightmare. But we don't at least have sewage in the streets. We don't have people living in the middle of parks and so on and so forth. Well, maybe we do. This is Austin. But anyway, you get the idea. There was a huge transformation. And yes, it overwhelmed problems about sanitation. And so, yes, sewage, raw sewage in the streets and so on became a huge problem in all these European cities. Other problems you might imagine.
Lack of housing. Lack of housing.
Lack of housing, yes. Where's the housing to put all of these people? They come flocking into the cities. A lot of people end up living in tents. They live in backyards. They live in makeshift shelters. And in some climates, that might not be so terrible. In England, where it starts first, that's awful. Other things, yes?
Increased crime.
Increased crime, yes. You've got a much greater population density, a lot of people in a small space. That's going to lead to an increase in crime. What else?
Not enough jobs?
Not enough, exactly. The transformation is so sudden that, in a sense, even though factories are being built here and so on, a lot of people come from the countryside having nothing to do. They get to the city, eventually there are going to be things for them to do, but it takes a while to build a factory and so on. And so, yes, there could be a massive problem of unemployment, and that's part of what leads to crime, although there are lots of other factors here too. Other things, yes?
Pollution from factories, like smokestacks?
Yes, pollution from the factories. Okay, suddenly you start building these factories in very densely populated cities. Initially, there's very little understanding of how to prevent them from fouling the air, fouling the water, so you've got massive problems of pollution, especially in large cities like London and Manchester. What else? Yeah? Safety. Okay, yes, there's going to be a huge problem with safety in these new mills. Actually, in the cities in general. Two of my great-grandfathers died in industrial accidents.
Yeah.
And that becomes a huge problem. The safety conditions in the mills are not good, but also the safety conditions on the roadways and so on, because these cities are suddenly overwhelmed and the infrastructure isn't there. It becomes a very dangerous place to be for all sorts of reasons. Yeah?
Organization, the city planning, like the street plans and everything.
Okay, good. You've got this massive problem of organization. All these people are flooding in. Some cities are built on a very rational plan, and so people sort of say, wait, we got to plan this out. There is a whole field of urban planning that's arisen from that. But in many places, there's no time to plan it out. People just come and it becomes crazy sort of thing. If you go to a lot of European cities, especially that were built up in this sort of era, you see strange winding streets and buildings that overhang the street and all sorts of things that you might think, who designed this? The answer is nobody designed this. People were scrambling to put things together as quickly as they could. Yeah?
Lack of resources like food and water.
Good. Lack of resources like food and water.
Yeah.
It might be that you're producing enough food, but how do you get that food from the farms into the cities? You've got to develop a transportation network. It used to be not so much of a problem. Most of your people were there in the countryside close to the food. Now all of a sudden they're not. And what system is going to bring the food from the farms to the cities where they now are? You've got a problem of creating that network and that marketplace that's going to make that possible. And that takes time. So initially they get there, they don't have much to eat. Other problems? Yeah?
Lack of education because our kids are working.
Good. Lack of education. On the farms, people are typically taught by their parents. They suddenly get to the cities. The parents might be working in factories. Maybe the kids are working in these factories. And so there's a real problem of education. Yeah?
Disease?
Disease, yes. Imagine you've got lots and lots of people and you haven't got the infrastructure. You've got sewage in the streets. There are cholera epidemics that occur throughout the 19th century, especially in the first half of the 19th century in the cities. It becomes a huge problem in London and Birmingham and a variety of other cities. And as other European cities and even American cities start catching up to that a little bit later, it becomes a problem there too. You've got massive outbreaks of disease. Yes?
Labor rights?
Labor rights. Okay, good. The way people are treated in these factories is not very good. This is before unions and so on. Sometimes you might have a nice boss who is concerned with you. In fact, I mentioned my great-grandfathers. One of them died not because of really a lack of safety in the mills exactly, and certainly not because of a problem with not having rights. What happened is that it was heat exhaustion. He was overcome by the heat in the mills. And the boss said, look, you can't stay here. You're clearly in trouble. I'll take you home. But my great-grandfather was coherent enough to say, no, I can get there. But a lot of bosses would not have done that. They would force him to do this. He happened to have a particularly nice one. He didn't have any special rights or anything like that. But what happened is he was on an open-air streetcar coming home, and he passed out from the heat, collapsed, and fell into the street and was run over by a car. So it's awful. My great-grandmother didn't find out for about 3 days what happened. I mean, he just didn't come home. And the boss actually then checked and said, I wanted to make sure he got home all right. And the answer was, well, no, he didn't. And it was a question of figuring out that unidentified body was his. But he was, as it were, well, obviously unlucky because of circumstances, but lots of bosses were not so nice to offer to take somebody home in such conditions. People didn't have any rights. They were often asked to work very long hours in very unsafe conditions for low wages and so on. So there were massive problems that resulted from all of this. Now, how did it really happen? Clothing was one of the first industries, actually, to be created. The invention of the power loom in 1787 transformed the making of clothes. Before this time, if you had one or two outfits of clothes, ideally two, right? So you'd be wearing one and you would have washed the other. And when you took these clothes off, well, great, the others could have been washed by then and dry, so you would switch between these two bits of clothing. That was what most people in the world did. Now, how many of you have only two outfits you can wear? Nobody, right? Even if you're quite poor, you can afford more than just two shirts, two pairs of pants or whatever, and that's something that really is a dramatic change as a result of the invention of the power loom. You had factories that looked something like this. Well, shortly thereafter, James Watt's steam engine became powerful enough to actually start doing some work. It was invented in the 1760s, but became very powerful by 1850, quite powerful by 1800. The steam engine initially was sort of a toy. There's Watt thinking it up in his laboratory. There's the very first one, big and didn't really accomplish very much. But within a short time, that led to the development of roads, of canals, of steamships that were capable of doing much more and carrying much more cargo at much higher speeds than sailing ships, for example, or horse-drawn carts and carriages. Railroads started around 1804. At first, a locomotive, pictured there, could go about 5 miles an hour.
All right.
Yeah, all right. It was still way faster than a horse-drawn thing could go. By 1830, it could go 16 miles an hour. 1850, 50 miles an hour. There were already 6,000 miles of track by 1850 in Great Britain alone. And so suddenly people were able to travel. Immanuel Kant was one of the great philosophers of the 18th century. He died, I think, in 1804, if I'm remembering correctly. He never traveled more than 10 miles from the place of his birth. That was commonplace in the 18th century. It would be rare that somebody would travel very far from the place of their birth. By 1850, people could travel all over Great Britain. And that quickly spread then to other countries. So, the ability to get around dramatically transforming what society at large was like. There was this vast movement to the cities. In 1800, London already had 1 million people, but there were no other cities in Britain over 100,000. And by 1850, London had 2.5 million almost, and there were 9 cities between 100,000 and 1 million. Now, it was true that working conditions were terrible. 12 to 16-hour days, noxious fumes, high temperatures, dangerous conditions. You look at the paintings even of the mills then, and some of the early photographs, and you see the conditions. That's Pittsburgh, actually. Well, that's how it looked around 1900. That's also how it looked more or less when I was a little kid growing up there. And I lived in that section of town, too. That's what we used to do for fun, by the way. On Saturday night, we'd walk down to the mills. It was typically hot enough that they would leave the ends open so you could see them pouring the steel. It was a very spectacular show. Anyway, yeah, life has changed. It's not like, hey, it's Saturday night, what do you want to do? Let's walk down the hill to the mill and watch them pour steel. But let me tell you something, in 1959, that was awesome. Okay, now, it did lead to a large number of people having some discretionary income. And so, at the same time manufacturing did provide jobs, even if they were very dangerous jobs for large numbers of people, it meant that the cost of goods were lowered enough that people actually had money left over to get things they wanted as opposed to merely things they needed. They could also trade much more with other parts of the world and so have things that they actually did want from other parts of the world. The ability to travel led to large increases in income and wealth. So here you see images of a typical social scene in London in 1820 and then in 1850. And you can already see the change in dress, the change in attitudes, the transformation and the development of a middle class, which was there by 1850, scarcely there by 1820. Well, we talked about sewage, disease, and all of that. There was huge inequality. By 1848, the top 1% had 35% of the national income. That is huge. Today, in most advanced industrial countries, the proportion would be somewhere between 15 and 20%. And people cry about inequality now. Well, I'm not saying it's not a problem now, but it was a vastly greater problem by the middle of the 19th century. However, the second industrial revolution that started around 1850 did a lot to change the effects of this and to not only promote the growth of the middle class, but also began to change working patterns in a way that was positive for the average person. How did that happen? Well, a lot of people, more and more as the century went on, did have discretionary income. They could worry about what they wanted as opposed to what they needed. And so people began to think about life in a different sort of way. It was no longer for the average person so much a struggle to survive by 1900. By 1850, even in the cities, it still kind of was. But by 1900, that was no longer true. There were new patterns of production, new patterns of consumption, new markets. There was a dramatic growth in population. Europe's population almost doubled in the second half of the 19th century. It was really not because of a great increase in birth rates. It was not because of mass immigration. It was because of the declining death rate. Fewer people were dying. Now, why? One element was the development of medicine. The germ theory of disease, in particular. Before that, people had no idea what caused diseases. Around 1850, as we'll see, people developed a theory about what caused disease, and that transformed health and sanitation. The second was simply plumbing. My grandfather was a plumber, and he used to say, "Who brings civilization to a land?" His answer was, plumbers. Now, why? Self-serving answer for a plumber, but nevertheless, here was his reasoning. What makes it possible for large numbers of people to live together in a city and actually develop a civilization, as opposed to simply having subsistence farms, where people don't see other people much, they can't communicate much, they can't develop anything, for the most part, that we would consider an advanced civilization? It's plumbing. Plumbing is what enables people to live together in cities without disease wiping them all out. And it was indeed the development of plumbing throughout the latter half of the 19th century. And again, that's in Britain and the most advanced parts of Europe. It was a little bit later elsewhere in the world, a little bit later here in the United States. But nevertheless, that transformation. I mean, how many of you have an indoor bathroom you can use? Again, everybody, right? How many people in even 1950 in the United States would have had an indoor bathroom? Well, a majority, but there would have been lots of outhouses. When I was a kid, there were still lots of outhouses you would see. How do you go to the bathroom here? Oh, you go to the backyard. And it smells really bad, so you hold your breath and so on and so forth. Okay? And that was typical even now in 1950 it was getting unusual, but in 1920 it was commonplace even in the United States. And so the transformation where people have indoor plumbing does change the way people live, and it makes disease much rarer. Now, the germ theory itself is an amazing story. It was devised initially by Ignaz Semmelweis, a Hungarian physician. He began studying the problem of a Vienna hospital. A large number of women were dying in childbirth from a certain kind of fever. And he began examining why people in this wing of the hospital had a much higher rate of death in childbirth from people in that side. Okay? For some reason, in this side of the hospital, very few women died of this fever. In this side of the hospital, many did. What was going on? It turned out that this clinic, this basically, what do you call it? The place where babies were born.
Oh, the maternity.
The maternity ward, thank you. That maternity ward was right next to the morgue. Doctors routinely would come from the morgue and go in to deliver babies. They did not wash their hands. Why would they wash their hands? Semmelweis began saying, wait a minute, that's why. You guys are coming in there, you're doing autopsies on dead bodies, diseased dead bodies, then you're going in and saying, here, let me help with the baby. That's why these women are dying. And so he insisted that doctors begin washing their hands. Initially with a solution of lime, which was not very kind to the skin. Semmelweis was thought to be insane. He was locked up in an insane asylum. Think about what he was saying. What makes you sick? It's all these little things you can't see crawling all over your body. And people say, "Ooh, ooh, ooh, ooh." And he died after a short time in the insane asylum. He was beaten to death by guards, presumably for going around saying, wash your hands, wash your hands. But he was right, he was completely right, and Louis Pasteur is the person who really then developed techniques for combating disease that were more sophisticated than simply washing your hands a lot. But still, that idea that yes, bacteria, viruses, and all sorts of things can transmit disease, and it's important to keep things clean, that's something that was unknown before Semmelweis. Yes?
They were going to the morgue and then delivering babies. Did the babies not get infected too? Was it only the mothers?
Well, babies, when they're first born, tend to be coated with this waxy stuff. So they were much less liable to it. They would quickly be then taken over by nurses and others who hadn't been in the morgue. So the main danger was really to the mother rather than the baby. And just because of that protective covering. I don't know if you've witnessed a childbirth. Probably not, but if you have, the first time, even if you're the dad, you tend to really be tempted to pass out. But, but anyway, the baby comes out with this waxy covering. So it was much less a problem for the babies than for the moms. Now, there is Semmelweis, by the way, and there's Pasteur in his lab. The process of pasteurization made a difference. In 1750, only about a third of babies survived birth. So it did make a significant difference to babies, too. By 1900, it was 85%. And of course, today it's much higher. But think about that, 33% to 85% of babies survived in the process of birth. And for women, it was similar. About 1 in 4 women died in childbirth back in the 18th century. And today, it's a very small number. Well, there were other important features. Not only was the death rate declining, but in certain parts of the world, by the end of the century, there was massive immigration. Not only immigration within countries, where we had 40% of the British population moving over a short period of time, and then over a little longer time, 60%, but we also saw the massive growth of cities. By 1900, London, which at the beginning of the century had 1 million people, had 6.5 million. There were now 147 European cities with populations over 100,000. So people were flocking to the cities all over Europe, and they were moving from one country to another as well. Look at what happened in the United States to population between 1850 and 1900. The population of Boston zoomed from 136,000 to 560,000. New York went from 515,000 to over 2 million. Look at Cleveland, 17,000 to 381,000. Detroit, 21,000 to 285,000. Chicago had only 25,000. Then it was 1.7 million by the end of the century. So a massive growth in the cities in the second half of the 19th century. The population went here as well as elsewhere from being largely rural to largely urban in a relatively short period of time. By the way, my grandmother had a geography book from 1915, and at the end it lists population of major cities. Los Angeles was a small city in 1915. Chicago was quite large, as you can see there already. But look at any city in the western United States. It was basically a small town. San Francisco, in fact, was the only large city anywhere west of Chicago, really, or St. Louis in those days. Well, there was also immigration, from overseas. This is a picture of Ellis Island, where many immigrants to the United States showed up. And here are pictures of people getting off ships and coming to the United States at Ellis Island. That too led to difficult conditions for many immigrants. Well, yeah, I went on and on, as you can see. But now, the growth of the steel industry, the growth of the chemical industry. Oh, that's a steel plant near where I grew up. You can still see it from an amusement park that's now there on the other side of the river. So as you're going down, it's actually awesome. These two coasters intertwine, and they go down the hill toward the river. And so it's fantastic. You're there, and you're sort of on the edge of this, and there are the steel mills across, and you're saying, whoa, that's really, and especially at night, it's like the mills are glowing and everything is very cool, and then you just plunge down the hill as if you're going toward the river. It's fantastic. Anyway, but yes, that's what it can look like at night on the other side of the river. Okay, and this is what it looks like inside the mill. Well, sometimes things went wrong, as you can see. So there was a serious problem of industrial accidents. It was not all good and growth and prosperity and so on. There were very real dangers that resulted from the growth of the steel industry, the chemical industry, from electricity and the development of electricity. That's something that happened right near the end of the 19th century. Edison invented the light bulb after finding about 10,000 things that did not work. And there are museums with lots of his early designs for light bulbs. The development of the telephone, the telegraph. And that's not a musical instrument, that's actually a telegraph with a piano-like keyboard rather than a typewriter-type keyboard. An early telephone, the development of radio, and then the invention of things like bicycles that made it easy for people to get around at a smaller scale than steamships and railways and so on. And then, of course, near the end of the century, the internal combustion engine. That is the first Ford automobile produced in 1896. And there is Henry Ford riding with his wife. Well, shortly after the turn of the century, then, the development of flight. 1903, the Wright brothers. So all of that changed life in pretty dramatic ways.